Everyone, in this lecture we're going to talk about acid-base balance during exercise. Acid and bases you guys should be familiar with, but basically acids are molecules that can liberate hydrogen ions, increase hydrogen ion concentrations in a solution, such as lactic acid. Bases are molecules that combine with hydrogen, decreasing that hydrogen concentration, so bicarbonate would be a strong base. pH scale goes from 1 to 14. 7 is neutral, so anything below a 7 is acidic. Anything above a 7 is basic. As you move towards the extremes, you become a stronger acid or a base. It is a logarithmic scale, so one point change corresponds to a tenfold change in those hydrogens. And pure water is technically kind of at that 7 mark, even though most of the water we drink is not pure water. And so you can get an example of things on this pH scale here. So realize our pH of our arterial blood. So all of our body has different pHs depending on where you're at. Stomach is very acidic, but typically when you think of body pH overall, you're thinking kind of that arterial blood. It's around a 7.4. And if you go above that, you're alkalosis. Below that is acidosis, and your body wants to maintain that 7.45, I think is actually even a more accurate number, wants to maintain that in a very narrow range. We don't want to get too far outside that because it is logarithmic, so a small change in that number is a pretty large change in the blood. So pH drops because there's accumulation of acid or loss of bases, or loss of acids and accumulation of bases leads to alkalosis, and you can see that there. So when it comes to it, there is a thing called metabolic acidosis or alkalosis. Acidosis, where you gain that acid in the body, can happen through high-intensity exercise where you're above lactate threshold for greater than 30 seconds and build up lactate levels. Long-term starvation can do the same thing because of ketoacids, or uncontrolled diabetes leads to diabetic ketoacidosis. So think about when you put yourself in a keto diet, what you're talking about is a acid or ketoacidosis and how that may cause effects. Alkalosis is a little less common, but it's the loss of acid from the body, so think severe vomiting or even kidney issues can lead to that. So when it comes to sources of hydrogens during exercise, a lot of it comes from the production of carbon dioxide, so the end product of oxidative phosphorylation, and also the production of lactic acid through glucose metabolism and glycolysis. And additionally, we do have some hydrogens being released during ATP breakdown. When it goes from ATP plus water, you get ADP, HPO4, and some hydrogen ions as well. And so you can kind of see how those all add up into this contracting skeletal muscles, increasing the amount of hydrogens and decreasing our pH, leading it to more acid. So high-intensity exercise lasting greater than 45 seconds produces a large amount of hydrogen ions. Again, a lot of this going directly back to that lactic acid and that energy system through glucose. So some sports are a risk for acid-base disturbance to the competitor. So sports where you're playing at 100% effort increases the risk, and also sports where you have to finish strong. So something you've been doing for a while, maybe built up at a small level, and then you have to sprint to the end or something along those lines would increase that risk. And the reason this is a problem is that acidosis, even if it's not whole body, but it's in a particular muscle, contributes to muscle fatigue, and this can cause muscle fatigue. So it causes our muscles to get tired easier because it causes this denaturing of proteins and doesn't allow them to work as efficiently. It's the body basically shutting itself down so that you don't cause major injury. We do have buffering systems that can help with this performance in events, and those can become greater, so we can survive them for a short time, but again, long times. It's unavoidable at very high exercises. And so this is a list that kind of demonstrates some of the activities that are higher versus low risk. Again, think shorter, high-intensity activities are going to be at a higher risk than kind of longer-term, less intense exercises. And so you can kind of see some of the different ones here. So high-intensity exercise results in that production of lactic acid, like we talked about, in muscle fibers and in bloods. inhibits performance, again, muscle fatigue, but also it inhibits those glycolytic and those citric acid cycle enzyme activities, and so it messes with ATP production. And also in those hydrogen ions compete with calcium in binding in the muscles, and so block where troponin is, where calcium binds to troponin, not allowing for those power strokes to occur. And so this is why we want to avoid that during exercise if possible. And so we do have ways to buffer this acid so we can keep going for a longer period of time and keep bodies running. And so these acid-base balance buffers release hydrogen ions when pH is too high, but when pH is low, they accept hydrogens. We have proteins that are buffers. We have phosphate groups that are buffers, and bicarbonate. So that bicarbonate system is kind of that. It can release and accept those hydrogens when needed. And so we have some extracellular buffers as well, which would be including carbonate, hemoglobin, and even some blood proteins. And so you can kind of see how those do that. Either they convert strong acids to weak acids, or they accept hydrogens directly. And so we talked about the bicarbonate buffer system with the pulmonary system some. And so we've kind of looked at that. You can see some of the systems that use to transport those hydrogens and how they do that. One thing to note is that compared to type 1 muscle fibers, type 2 muscle fibers have a higher buffering capacity. And this makes sense because think about the energy systems in our type 2 fibers. They're much more glycolytic, more lactic acid, so they need to be able to buffer more, but also they have less of a blood supply. They have less of that carbonic acid, bicarbonate system to get that CO2 out, and so they need to be able to buffer a little bit stronger than our type 1s that have a higher blood flow and are using more, not having higher rates of lactate because of the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. High-intensity exercise actually helps to increase the buffering capacity of our muscles and makes them less susceptible to that acidosis. There are some nutritional supplements that may help a little bit with those high-intensity exercise, and basically they slow down the time to exhaustion. You can go for a longer period of time before you hit exhaustion. These would be things like some sodium bicarbonate, beta-alanine, sodium citrate. In extremes, they do cause some side effects like upset stomach, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Sometimes it's just some tingling of the skin. How much effective they are is still kind of up for debate. There are some evidence that they can increase that, but the amount that you need and how effective it is, and if you have a normal diet, how much more it adds is not 100% clear at this time. So our lungs also help to remove CO2, which helps eliminate. So that's another reason we breathe, to kind of help buffer and keep that acidosis at bay. Again, with that carbonic acid system, that's kind of short-term. Long-term, our kidneys are important. They will get rid of bicarbonate by excreting it out of the blood. And so the kind of the long-term system is kidneys, where that can play a role if those are acting, are not acting properly or not functioning properly. So kidneys long-term, kind of our lungs are short-term, along with those other buffers. So the production of hydrogen ions is really going to be dependent on exercise intensity, the amount of muscles involved. If you don't have as much muscle, you're not going to change the pH as much, how long you've been doing that. But we do know that blood pH declines with increased intensity of exercise, and so does muscle pH as well. Muscle pH is usually lower than our blood pH, and you can kind of see that here, how much the muscle goes down versus the blood. Remember, things in the muscles will eventually go into the blood, so it kind of falls first, goes lower, and then your blood kind of takes over. And so you can see the capacity for different things to buffer those hydrogen ions in the muscle, and also kind of as you go into the blood as well. And so what you can see is it changes over time in arterial concentrations through exercise work rate. So the intensity, we see that bicarbonate buffer goes down as intensity gets higher, lactate goes up. So that makes sense. They're kind of competing, kind of buffering. and then pH goes down as we get to those extremes because it can't keep up. And so our intracellular buffers are our first line of defense for that, and then we have our blood buffers and respiratory system to kind of continue that on after that occurs. And so again, first line, second line, you can see how cellular and then our respiration and blood buffers take over. And so that's kind of our acid-base balance. So the idea with this is to get a picture of it and then start relating it back to all the other systems we've talked about and why some places may need a higher buffing capacity while others do not, and kind of weighing those and being able to relate that information back. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you for the next lecture.